Hi. So the story behind this video is that I was recently asked to give a 2-hour presentation on writing. And after doing that, I decided that I wanted to share the introduction to that webinar. So that's what this video is. It's a modified version of that introduction. A nice thing about this webinar for me personally is that I've been writing for about 10 years and I'm about to be getting away from it. So this has been a nice way for me to summarize and organize my own thoughts before I take this break. For those who don't know me, my name is Alvin Alexander. Besides the alliteration, an interesting thing about my name is that when things are going well, people call me Al. And when things are not going so well, somehow everyone always knows to yell, Alvin! Because this is a discussion about writing, I'm going to further introduce myself in the form of a story. Like many stories, this one begins with once upon a time. So once upon a time, in the early 1900s, my mother's parents moved from Poland to Chicago. And around that same time, my dad's parents moved to Chicago from somewhere in the Middle East. Nobody knows exactly where they lived, but we do know that they were Assyrian. And my grandfather used to always talk about things like Mesopotamia and Babylon. Somehow my parents met, they got married, they had children, and because of our Assyrian and Polish backgrounds, we refer to our heritage this way. And the blending of this DNA is important, as you'll soon see in our story. I had 3 older sisters. For the purposes of this story, the important part about them is that they wore down my parents. So by the time I got to high school, my parents pretty much just let me do whatever I wanted, which included not going to school, which you can tell from this highlighted passage in my yearbook. And so the years went on, and despite rarely being there, I graduated from high school. And skipping forward a few more years, I graduated from Texas A&M University with a degree in aerospace engineering. And this was in the late 1980s, and I was the young guy. So when I went to work in Virginia for an aerospace company, they said, "You're the computer guy." And I had my own office, and then across the hall, there was another office that looked like this. It had 3 desks in a row, and it had 3 computers stacked up on those desks. And I would often have one chair, especially on the weekends, and I would slide back and forth between those 3 computers to get my work done. And the reason for this is because the computers I was using then are kept in museums now. They're old, old IBM PCs running really early versions of MS-DOS. So I became the computer guy. I did a lot of Fortran 77 programming, and this was in Virginia. And eventually that led me to work on a NASA space shuttle project in Mississippi. And I lived in Alabama. So every day I went back and forth across the border between Mississippi and Alabama. And once again, they said, "You're the computer guy." So I taught myself Unix, networking, and I should mention, this was well before Linux. So I worked on digital equipment machines and IBM and Silicon Graphics machines. And that led me to learning programming languages. So I taught myself C. And the thing I loved about C was like you could do these things, they're really low level as far as communicating with a computer. And then somehow I discovered Perl, which may or may not have been through an O'Reilly book. I don't remember for sure. But the thing I loved about Perl was you could be productive at such a higher level than you could with C. So that was, Fortran 77, C, Perl were my first 3 programming experiences. And then Java came around in 1996, and I learned it. And this led me to starting my own business. So I created my own software development consulting firm, and we grew it from a basement to 20 employees. And we literally grew it from the basement. We used to get on these conference calls with Papa John's or Kroger, and this dog in particular, being a Siberian Husky, would either howl or start talking during the middle of the conversation. So we realized we had to get out of the basement and into an office. But that all went really well. We grew the business, like they said, to 20 people. Things were great until, and I guess I should say, until one day I started to get sick, really sick, and nobody knew why. And I used to ask people, "Do you feel worse as you get older?" And I specifically remember walking down the hallway with a vice president of Papa John's. I was probably about 30 years old, and I assume he was like 50 years, in his 50s or 60s. And I said, like when you got to 28, 30 years old, did you start feeling a lot worse? And he said, no, I still feel fine today. And so through several of these conversations, I realized I was getting sicker and nobody else was. It wasn't aging, so it was just me. So like any normal person, I sold my business and sold all my belongings. And I guess I should say, I remember having this feeling that I was getting very sick and doctors couldn't figure out what it was. And I was like, I don't want to die without experiencing more of the world. It's like I'd been so focused on work, and I was like, I just had this vision of dying in the office, and I'm like, that's not how I want it to end. So I want to discover other places. So by this time, I think my wife and I had already separated. So I sold the business, sold almost everything I owned, and moved to Alaska. And when I say that I sold everything, I literally did. Um, what I did was I created this, I call this a RAV4 simulator, this yellow area up here, 3 foot by 4 foot by 6 feet. So anything that fit in this area would fit in my RAV4, and everything else that didn't fit, I was either going to sell or give away. So I did that. I started to drive. Very, very fortunate. I happened to leave in May. I didn't even know about this, but as I was driving through Western Canada and up into Alaska, all the bears were coming out of hibernation. So I was just driving down the road, and you're like, hey bear, hey bear, hey bear, hey bear. So there was well over 100 bears, and they were all really nice except for this brown one up here in the upper right corner. I don't know if he was mean or just having a really bad day, but you can tell by that look he was not someone to be messed with. And once I got up there, you could find me meditating in the mountains. So I was in this area, and then behind these mountains over here. And then the important thing related to our webinar is that I began writing. So I already had a website named devdaily.com, which had some blog posts on it. And then because of this downtime that I had, I started writing a lot more. I started exploring technologies and writing about them. And this website is now alvinalexander.com. But a key part about this right here is that when I took a day off from writing, I felt like I missed something, right? So you'd go off and you go on a hike, you'd have a great hike. You might see some moose or some wolves or something like that. You're like, oh my God, you're coming back. You're like, what a great day. And then this little thought would come up in your mind, it's like, but I sure did I miss writing. I wish I had written something. And so you have this itch. So you grab a pad of paper or a computer or laptop, and you go up to the coffee shop and you write. And I can tell you that in retrospect, if you have those feelings, you may be a writer. Another important part about this adventure is that this whole cause and effect lifestyle was the writing on my website gave me confidence. You start getting feedback from people too. At that time, I allowed comments on the website, and people would give me feedback, and they would be like, oh, thank you so much. That was really helpful. So that started giving me confidence, and that led me to self-publish these 2 books. So the book over here on the left is called How I Sold My Business, a Personal Diary. And the thing that's unique about it is most business books, they will teach you how much your business is worth, and they might go through some of the mechanics of that process. But no, there was no book at that time that said, what you're going to be doing today is you're going to be talking to customers and prospects, and you might be hiring employees. And then at night, you're going to be trying to sell your business. And, everything that goes through your mind when you're going through something like that. So that's my diary of the time trying to sell the business. And then the second book, the one on the right here, was when I did own that consulting company. We always thought, gosh, I wish we had a book that we could give to new employees to tell them what it's like to be a consultant, just like an introduction to consulting book. And that's what this book is. So during this time, I moved to Colorado. And again, doctors just kept saying, oh, don't worry, about how you're feeling. It's probably just blood pressure or something simple like that. And then I kept getting sicker and sicker. And then finally, I started going unconscious. And that's when doctors started taking things much more seriously. And we did a lot more tests. I've had definitely had over 150 blood tests in my life. I don't know if I've had over 200, but I definitely had over 150. So you end up seeing many, many specialists during all this time until one day, I finally met Dr. number 26, who said, I think this is what you have. And we really started with Dr. number 24, who kind of got into the ballpark, and then Dr. number 25 veered off a little bit, and then we came back to Dr. number 26. So I could tell you hundreds of stories about this illness, but I'll tell you 3. One night I had just gone and I was laying in bed, and I was thinking about something, and then a bone in my left foot broke while I was laying in bed. And I can tell you that hurts a lot. I couldn't walk for 3 or 4 days, couldn't even fit my foot into a shoe after that experience. Then I used to tell doctors it felt like I was being poisoned. And the only terms I knew, like from movies and books or my own history, was sepsis and like toxic shock syndrome. And I would later learn through this disease that what was going on was I was going through anaphylactic shock or anaphylaxis. So it wasn't a blood pressure issue. It was basically that I was being poisoned to the point that I would go unconscious. But until doctor number 26, nobody had any idea what was going on with that. I also had what I call 3 fake heart attacks during this time. So this is when your allergies are so bad that it restricts the blood flow to your heart. And this was called allergic angina. So again, I could tell you many more stories, but the name for this is mast cell activation syndrome. It didn't even have this name until 2013. It's more commonly known as bubble boy syndrome, or this movie from 1976 about the boy in the plastic bubble. Seinfeld, they had the bubble boy in the northern exposure. I remember Mike Monroe used to walk around outside in a spacesuit. And after a while, I kind of wish I had one of those too, because you feel like you're allergic to the planet or you're born on the wrong planet. And more recently and more seriously, this woman, and I apologize, I can't remember her name right now. In 2017, this story was featured on the Today Show. And so this was several years before COVID. And she has the same disease I do, but she has it much worse than I do. We both kind of eat the same 25 foods that allow us to get through life. And that's basically all you can do. But some of us have to live like in separate rooms, basically, from other people. But getting back to our story, because of doctor number 26, we were able to find some solutions, which involves a lot of pills that are right over there. So our protagonist in the story was able to get back to work. And when he got back to work, he began writing and writing. So I wrote the Scala Cookbook, which is over 700 pages, the Functional Programming Simplified 728. I wrote 2 versions of the Scala book, one for Scala 2 and the other one for Scala 3. Those were about 250 pages each. And I started to write this book, and I didn't finish it yet, but I kept it here because I like the cover, basically. And the reason I didn't finish it actually was because I had this commitment to write the second version of the Scala Cookbook. So it was released in August and September of 2021. And for most of the time as a new release, it was the #1 new release in functional programming and the #1 new release in object-oriented programming. So that was really cool. And so that's the end of our story. We can leave it with the end, but hopefully it's something more like happily ever after, or to be continued. And as I went on telling you that story for about 12 minutes, you may have wanted to start calling me Alban. But what you don't know is that I hopefully just taught you at least 10 things while I was telling that story. So we'll take a look at those. #1, people love stories. And we know this from people telling stories, over the campfire and passing down stories long before writing. This was how we communicated, and we communicated morals and adventures and things like that. And people love stories more than facts. So unless you're watching something like Jeopardy, we generally aren't just interested in, a regurgitation of facts. And we know that people love stories because all the movie studios in the world right now. And if you think about Apple commercials, they rarely tell us about the specifics of any processor or anything like that. What they do instead is they show stories about how people are using their products and how using their products make them feel. The second thing was stories help with recall. So if I asked you these questions, hopefully you could answer, which bear was the mean one and how many computers did I use when I worked in Virginia. But if I'd stated these as facts, you might not be able to recall them as well. So stories help make information more memorable. And it's even more memorable when we have a story that includes images. So images help with recall. So I showed this mean-looking brown bear, and that was another way, adding that image to the story was a way of making it more memorable. But when we can't use images, we can use imagery. So we can use words like brown bear, which not too great in this case. We could say angry brown bear or mean brown bear. Or I could have described more and just said, this is, he was coming out of hibernation. He was probably just really hungry. But however we use our words here in this imagery, this is where our creativity comes in. And this is what makes our writing unique, because anyone could look at that and say there is an angry brown bear, but then it's like, how do we actually describe that? How do we put that into words? And so words are the tools of our craft, and we choose them carefully. I remember Steve Jobs, there was a story about Steve Jobs that he was famous for worrying about one word in an advertisement. And he would stay up late at night on the phone with either the writer or an editor, and they would discuss that one word for hours. And if that sounds extreme, that's kind of how writers think on a daily basis. We'll look at a sentence and be like, gosh, that just isn't right. Oh. And then you just keep working on it. There's also different types of learners. And so people learn differently, and they're categorized in different ways. I've seen people say, there's 3 different types of learners, 4, 8, whatever it is. But as communicators, it's our job to understand this and then try to reflect that in our writing. So we want to respect and kind of cater to different types of learners. And if all we can do is write text, we use, of course, our words. But if we have an opportunity to use graphics or other forms of media, we do that. So, if you only have words, you could say the Boston Red Sox started the 2007 season on a tear, while the other 4 teams floundered until July when the New York Yankees, came to life. But if you can add a little sparkline graphic like this next to the words, it adds so much to your story, and it also helps other people who are different types of learners. So you can definitely see, the Boston Red Sox at the beginning of the season just ran away with it. The other teams floundered until July, and then that's when the Yankees got better. And you can see from the slope of the curve here at the end of the season, the Yankees were playing better than the Red Sox. So that's just one example of how we can use graphics with our documents. And within the rest of the discussion, I'll talk about how we can use other formats for different types of learners. So you can have, videos, podcasts, whatever. Number 6, the best stories teach us. So hopefully they have moral values. And the big one here for me is the Andy Griffith Show from the 1960s. And in that show, almost every episode, Andy was either teaching Opie or trying to teach Barney some type of lesson. And in some of those episodes, actually, Andy was being taught lessons. So it was just kind of a classic show for having moral values and stories. And so we can reflect on the story that I told now and say, when I told you this story, what lessons or moral values come to your mind? And one I kind of mentioned actually a little bit was karma, a little bit of cause and effect. He was the young aerospace guy, and then they said, you're the computer guy that led me to starting a business. Then I got sick, and that led me to do other things. So there's this cause and effect thing where this guy is kind of bouncing around in the wind. And then the second story is persistence, whether or not our protagonist was persistent or not. And, that's subject to interpretation. Was he bouncing around in the wind, or, did he just kind of keep trying to go? A third point, if you happen to be old enough, this was a television series from the 1970s. And if you know this series and the character that I have circled up here in the red, a third interpretation of the story was maybe that there's just some guy trying to figure out what's important in life. But however you look at it, that's the beauty of stories, is that people can debate these things. Number 7, you don't know it yet, but I actually taught you a little bit about editing. I deleted a bunch of slides from that story, and this is one that I've kind of kept here for the purposes of this discussion. As a brief aside, you can tell because it's over there on the side, my last name isn't really Alexander. Nobody knows what it is. As the story goes, my grandfather told me this. They came over from the Middle East through Ellis Island, and the person there couldn't couldn't understand their last name or figure out how to spell it. So they said, your last name is Alexander, welcome to America. And if you read on the internet, you'll see that a lot of people say this is a hoax, but I know my grandfather told me that directly. But for the purposes of our writing, this wasn't really essential to the story. And we run into this a lot in technical writing. So like in the O'Reilly cookbooks, what we do is you have sections for tips and notes and then asides, and we keep all those things over on the side typically. And that's what I was going to do here with this one. I was just making an aside. It's not essential to the story. So as a writer and as an editor, you have to decide what's essential to the story. Am I going to keep it in? And it's a lot like being a movie director, which is kind of cool. And this is what editing looks like. And I always tell people it's brutal and it's hard to do to yourself, and it's even harder to do to others. But what I like to say now is, back in the early days, I used to fret and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I put so much work into the original text. I can't believe I'm doing this to myself. But what I think of now is I'm replacing those old bad words with new, better words. And once you realize that and you're coming out with a better product in the end, that really helps. And I also find that this quote from Marcus Aurelius helps when I'm editing the work of other people. So you want to, the thing you want in the end is you want to have the best product you can. So just do that, but do it with kindness and humility when you're editing, because you know how bad your own writing is when you're editing it. And what do we edit? Well, we edit everything. And I will show examples of each of these later, but as an example, when I'm editing, sorry, I'm just moving something around here. When I'm editing for clarity and specificity, I could have improved my story by giving you more accurate details. And I need to move that down so I can see it. So more accurately, I had a bad reaction to something in 1999. So the doctors at that point were saying, you may have MS or Lou Gehrig's disease. And then all throughout this period, 1999 through today, actually, I would tell doctors it feels like I've been poisoned. And so that led me to, in 2007, to selling my business. And I had moved to Alaska. And then syncope, which is a word for going unconscious or passing out, the first one happened in 2014. And then that would continue to happen 7 more times through 2016 and twice more after that. Then in 2015, one of the doctors, number 24, said, or 25, said, I think you might have a deadly tumor. And I'm sorry, I don't recall, but it's a adrenal gland tumor. And so they did 3 MRIs trying to find it. And I can't remember, you either had a 10% chance of surviving the surgery or a 10% chance of not surviving. I'm sorry, I can't remember, but anyway, they're just like, you may or may not survive the surgery, but have a nice day. But in terms of clarity and specificity, again, a graphic can help here, or I could have been more detailed in my original descriptions of that story. And being specific makes the story more clear, and you'd be surprised how much better it makes the story. Another interesting note about editing is that I remember reading in I think it was in the Stephen King book here called On Writing, and probably has a different cover today. But at some point he had sent in a manuscript to a publisher, and they sent it back and they said, this is a really good story. So if you just delete 10% of it, I think we can sell it. And, as an author, you're sitting there and going, well, if I could have deleted 10%, I would have done that, right? Or maybe he was young enough that he didn't know that. So that's a good, this is something that people don't do a lot, right? And I think it's kind of a pitfall with some books is when you write, the old saying goes, when you write from the heart. And then when you edit from the brain. And I'll talk about that more during the rest of this presentation. But the key here is, like Stephen King was told, just go ahead and delete 10% of your story and it'll be much tighter, and I think we can sell it. And Steve Jobs had a nice way of summarizing that. And he used to say, just get rid of the crap, right? And that actually applies. That's exactly what editing is we get rid of the crap. The 8th thing I may have taught you was a little bit about imagination. So we'll come back to that in just a second, but here's an example of imagination. I was in the hospital. I knew I was going to be in the hospital for a few days, so I brought a couple of books with me. One was on Zen, and I can't remember the other one was, some kind of meditation book also. And a nurse came in and she saw those books, and that prompted her to open up. So we had lunch together that first day. Then she came back the second day and she said, "Hey, I wanted to let you know I know you're really sick, and I just feel like I can share this with you." And she told me that she was dying. So we had lunch together every day during that time that I was in the hospital. And I didn't want to share that story publicly. But what I did was I wrote a little children's story about two bears. So that's a case where you use your imagination to create a story. So now, really, again, I'm talking more about fiction, and writers like to play this other game. And I knew about this game before. So you look at something like this image and you describe, what do you see? And that's part of being a writer. So you have these mountains and they're covered in snow and so on. So you kind of describe what you see, and again, that's part of your creativity. It makes you who you are as a writer. The other thing is we play this game where we say, what don't you see? What don't you see there? And I mentioned that before that I was meditating behind, on the other side of these mountains. So that's one example of something you don't see. So this is a fun game that writers like to play, and I knew about it. And then I knew about it kind of like intuitively, and then I was reminded about it when I watched this movie. And this one, Morgan Freeman plays an old writer, and he teaches that lesson to the girl in the white dress here. So that's a really good movie if you're interested in writing. And the next thing is number 9, is that we influence, as writers, we influence things that readers may or may not follow up on. So for example, as a writer, I told you about these 2 things. I told you about this young man over here, and then I just told you about this story here. So as a writer, I just told you those 2 things. And then as a reader, if you've never heard of them before, you have this opportunity. You can choose to follow up on these leads or not. And that's an interesting thing about writing, is that we get to share our own lives and our own personality in our stories. And this is even true like in technical books. So in the Scala cookbook, I referred to some of these names. And an interesting part about this is when I do slip these into my writing and you see these words as a reader, how does that make you feel? And I suggest it's probably one of 2 things. First thing is you're like, oh, cool. This guy's got an inside reference. He shared an inside reference and I get it. And so I share something in common with this person. And then the second possibility is, I don't know what he's talking about. Should I follow this breadcrumb? And so as authors, we have this power to take people on journeys, even in technical writing, that are outside of the current document. And the 10th thing, I didn't really teach this, but it's gonna come into play several times during our whole discussion, so I wanted to mention it here, is that there's 3 steps involved in teaching and also in technical writing. So way back in 1995, I was actually an SEO Unix authorized instructor, and they made me take a train the trainer course. And I didn't realize I left the slide in here, but I can prove I was an authorized instructor because I still have the clock. And apparently this is one of the things that I thought was important enough to keep in my little 72 cubic foot RAV4 simulator. But anyway, what they taught us was teaching is a 3-step process. So first thing you do is you tell students what you're going to tell them. The second thing you do is you tell them the thing. And then the third thing you do is you tell them what you just told them. So for example, if I was teaching in class on how to bake cookies, the first thing I would say, students, today we're going to learn how to make cookies. Second thing is we would actually go through the process of baking the cookies. And the third thing I would say at the end of the class is remember how we made the cookies. And a key here is that we do the same thing in several forms of technical writing, and I'll discuss that more in a little while. So to recap what I just covered, people love stories, number 1. Unless you're playing Jeopardy, people don't love facts, they love stories, and stories help with recall. And images like the brown bear help with recall. And if we can't use images, we use imagery. So we think about how to describe that brown bear. And that's part of the beauty. The words are the tools of our craft. There's different types of learners. So we use images and imagery and video and audio and webinars and any other tool we can to teach. The best stories teach us. I think of the Andy Griffith Show. Editing is, Stephen King's This minus 10%, or Steve Jobs, Get Rid of the Crap. Number 8 is imagination. What do you see and what don't you see? Number 9 was breadcrumbs. So as writers, we can lead readers on journeys outside of the current document. We provide these little clues, and then it's up to them whether or not they follow them or not. Number 10, there's 3 steps of teaching and learning. And I just mentioned those. Now, that was a lot to cover, but the interesting thing here is the reason I originally took you through my life story is something else, one more thing. And this last thing is templates. So templates are your friend. So if you're a novice technical writer, they're used all the time and they're really great. So you just basically, the short version of the story is you find a template, you fill it in. So you don't have to be creative. And as just one example of that, when I told you my life story here, I used a template, and that actually turns out to be a very famous template from Pixar. And you know all their great stories, beginning with Toy Story and so on. So I just followed their Pixar storytelling rules. So I told the story of once upon a time, there was a guy named Al. Every day he went to work. One day he got very sick, and because of that, he sold his business. Because of that, he moved to Alaska and started writing. And until finally he met Dr. Number 26. So the long story that I just told you actually is just all part of this template. And another key here is that Pixar has made billions and billions of dollars off of this template. So when I say to use templates later, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. They're proven templates. So go ahead and just fill them in. There's a cute template. There's a thing called Mad Libs, and this is a way of working with children to become storytellers. So part of a story is written, and then you work with the children to fill in the blanks to tell a new story that you make up on the fly, which is really cool. And you'll see later in the presentation, in the business world and technical world, we have these case study templates, and every case study looks almost exactly like this. So basically you have a client wants something, but there's always a problem. And then we solve that problem using so-and-so technologies and techniques. And then this is the result of that. So again, the moral of this story is, as a novice technical writer, or maybe even an experienced technical writer, you just grab the template and fill it in. And you can be creative in your writing, but you don't have to be creative in the format like that. And so because I added number 11 there, I added to our recap list. So I call this a recap, or I could also call it, things I learned while Al told a story. And if all's going well, hopefully your brain is feeling something like this right now. And if I was clever, I might lean in and say something like, show me. I can't really fit that into the story yet. So instead, I'll say that if you care to join me on this journey for the next 90 minutes, our quest will be to explore the art and craft of writing.